circumstances that led to Nolan Wells entering the water. Last time we saw him on the videos, he was without a shirt. Somebody saw something. Somebody knows something. Why is Nolan Wells dead?
A forensic pathologist in Washington, D.C. was given one question to answer. How did this 18-year-old die? When the body reached him, part of it was missing. Not through misconduct, through sequence. Mississippi had already performed its own autopsy, and it had kept the structures of the neck, the trachea, the larynx, the hyoid bone, the exact parts you examine when you need to know whether someone was strangled. So he worked with what he could reach. He opened the back of the head, a dissection the first autopsy never performed, and in the deep tissue he documented an area of red discoloration that he could not explain. He could not tell you what caused it. He could not tell you how Nolan Wells died. What he wrote instead is the line that has reset this entire case. He cannot rule out that non-accidental factors contributed to this death. That is not a conclusion. It is not a finding of foul play. And within hours, it was being reported as both. Tonight, exactly what that report says, exactly what it does not, and why the one number everybody is quoting from it is the part you should trust least. A word before we begin. This case involves the death of an 18-year-old, and tonight we'll be discussing autopsy findings in clinical terms. There's nothing graphic here, but if this is difficult for you, please take care of yourself while you watch. If you're new here, welcome, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read them. And to everyone who's followed this case with us, thank you. Your comments and shares are the reason careful coverage reaches people before the rumors do. Let's start with who conducted this examination. Because in a case defined by distrust, the identity of the examiner isn't a footnote. It's the foundation everything else rests on. Dr. Roger Mitchell is board certified in both anatomic and forensic pathology. He's a graduate of Howard University and the New Jersey Medical School. He completed his pathology residency at George Washington University Hospital, where he served as chief resident. And from 2014 to 2021, roughly 7 years, he was the chief medical examiner of Washington, D.C. During that period, he briefly held a second role as well, serving as the city's interim deputy mayor for public safety and justice. He's been described as the only forensic pathologist ever to hold both positions at once, meaning he has sat on both sides of the table, as the scientist producing findings and as the official responsible for what a city does with them. Today, he's a professor at Howard University College of Medicine, where he chaired the Department of Pathology, and he serves as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization representing black physicians in the United States. His record beyond the credentials matters too. He has performed thousands of forensic examinations across his career and testified as an expert in dozens of cases. He co-authored a book on deaths in custody and how the systems that investigate them fail. He served on a federal forensic science standards board. He has reviewed nationally known cases where an original ruling of undetermined was later re-examined. That specialization is worth naming plainly because it explains why this family sought him specifically. His career has been substantially built on a single uncomfortable question. What happens when an official finding and the physical evidence don't sit comfortably together? Now, who paid for it? Because that answers a question a lot of people have asked. The independent examination was funded by Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights camp. That organization runs a program specifically for this purpose, covering the cost of independent autopsies for families who want a second opinion and can't afford one. Historically, it has focused on deaths involving people in the custody of law enforcement, corrections, or immigration authorities. Nolan's death doesn't fit that category. He wasn't in anyone's custody, which tells you something about how this case has been positioned and why the money arrived from outside Mississippi entirely rather than from any government agency. It also tells you why the family's team can point to independence as a feature. No state agency, no local budget, no institutional relationship with anyone in Jackson County. Now here is a detail almost no coverage has flagged, and you need it before we go one line further into the report. Dr. Mitchell was not at that press conference. The findings reached the public through Ben Crump, reading aloud from the document at a podium. The written report was subsequently made available, so the language can be checked. But the framing you heard in the first wave of coverage, the emphasis, the phrasing, Which sentences got read slowly and which got summarized came from an attorney whose professional role is advocacy on behalf of this family. That is not an accusation. It's how legal press conferences work everywhere, in every case. But it creates a specific risk that has already played out in this story more than once. The pathologist's careful, hedged, deliberately limited language gets translated into something firmer on its way to a headline. So the standard we're applying tonight is simple. Where the report's own words are available, we use the report's words. Where a characterization came from the podium rather than the page, we'll say so. Keep that filter running, because it's about to matter a great deal. Now the finding itself. During the examination, Dr. Mitchell performed a layered dissection of the back of the head and neck. In the deep, soft tissue overlaying the occipital bone, the bone at the lower back of the skull, he documented an area of red discoloration. The report describes it as a focal area measuring 12 by 8 inches. Stop here, because this is the number racing across the internet right now, and it's being handled carelessly almost everywhere. 12 by 8 inches is what multiple established outlets reported after reading directly from the report. So, that is the figure on the record, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. But think about what it describes anatomically. That is not a small contained mark. That is an area covering essentially the entire back of a person's head and upper neck. And that scale sits uneasily beside the word the report itself uses, focal, which in pathology means localized and contained. Why does that tension matter so much? Because a large diffuse area of discoloration is exactly what you would also expect from causes that involve no violence at all. Blood settles in a body after death. It pools in whatever areas sit lowest relative to gravity. Nolan was found face down in the water, which means the back of the head was, in that position, an area where pooling would be entirely expected. Add advanced decomposition, which the report confirms was present, and you have a second process that discolors tissue on its own. So the honest way to state this is, the finding is real, it is documented, the number is what was read from the report, and what that number means remains a completely open question. Anyone telling you 12 by 8 inches proves he was struck is filling in a blank the pathologist himself deliberately left empty. Because here is what Dr. Mitchell actually wrote about it. The cause of that discoloration is unclear. There were no lacerations of the skin above it. There was no fracture of the skull beneath it. And in his assessment, given the extensive decomposition and the absence of any associated injuries, the finding was inconclusive as evidence of injury sustained before death. He flagged it anyway, not as a conclusion, but as something significant enough to warrant further investigation. That's the correct scientific posture, and it's worth respecting rather than upgrading. An independent forensic pathologist with no connection to this case, the chief medical examiner of a large Texas county, put the two possibilities plainly when asked, that discoloration could represent decompositional changes in the musculature, or it could represent blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. Two very different explanations. Nothing currently available distinguishes between them. So how would anyone ever tell the difference? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, and it's a piece of forensic science almost no coverage of this case has bothered to explain. The technique is called looking for vital reaction. When a living body is injured, it responds. Blood vessels break, but the body also mounts a biological reaction to that damage. Inflammatory cells arrive, tissue begins responding. A repair process starts within minutes to hours. Under a microscope, a pathologist can look for those signs. Their presence indicates the injury happened while the person was alive. Their absence points toward damage that occurred after death, or toward something that was never an injury at all. That microscopic examination is the tool that separates a bruise from blood pooling and an impact from an artifact. But here's the problem, and it's the recurring theme of this entire report. Decomposition degrades exactly the cellular detail that examination depends on. The longer the interval, and the more advanced the breakdown, the harder it becomes to read that signal reliably. The examination happened on July 10th. Nolan disappeared on July 4th. Days had passed, in warm Gulf water. So the tool that would answer the question was itself compromised by time before anyone got the chance to use it. That is not anyone's fault. It's the physical reality this case is operating inside, and it explains why a careful pathologist wrote unclear rather than picking a side. Now here's a detail that got almost no attention, and it may be the single most consequential sentence in the entire report. That finding could not have been observed in the first autopsy, not because anyone was careless, but because the posterior head and neck dissection required to see it was not performed during the state's examination. Sit with the implication. This is not two examiners looking at the same thing and reaching different conclusions. This is a finding that exists in the public record only because a second, independent examination happened at all. Without this family's decision to commission one, and without an outside organization paying for it, nobody would know this area of discoloration was there. Whatever it eventually turns out to mean, that fact alone is going to be discussed for a long time in cases like this one. And what's just as important is everything Dr. Mitchell did not find. He performed extensive additional dissections, specifically hunting for blunt force injury: the face, the ribs, the pelvis, the back, the buttocks, the arms, the legs. Across all of it, no fractures, no deep tissue injuries beyond the single area already described. That genuinely narrows the picture, and it deserves as much airtime as the finding itself. A body that had sustained a prolonged beating, a violent struggle, or a serious fall would typically show injuries in multiple locations: defensive injuries on the forearms, bruising in several places, fractures. That pattern is not present here. It doesn't rule out that something happened to Nolan, but it moves the plausible range away from a sustained violent assault and towards something far more specific, or something entirely consistent with an accident. I want to say that clearly because the online conversation has skipped past it almost entirely. The absence of those injuries is a real finding produced by a thorough examination, and it points away from the most extreme theories circulating about this case. That's what he found. Now the limitations, and this is where the report gets serious. When Nolan's body arrived in Washington, certain structures weren't with it, specifically the anterior neck structures: the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone. The internal architecture of the front of the neck. Mississippi's medical examiner had retained them. Dr. Mitchell was careful and fair about this in his own report. He noted explicitly that retaining these structures after a first examination is a common, standard forensic practice. Not something unusual, not something improper. He didn't allege misconduct, and neither will we. But here's the consequence. In his words, a posterior neck dissection performed without review of the anterior neck structures is incomplete, and therefore he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to, or a cause of, Nolan's death. Read that carefully, because the distinction is everything. He did not find evidence of neck injury. He was not able to look for it because the structures that would answer that question were 3 states away. Now here's where this breakdown gives you something almost no coverage of this case has. The hyoid bone comes up constantly in cases like this, because a fractured hyoid is the classic textbook indicator examiners look for in suspected strangulation. That's true as far as it goes, but there's a crucial qualifier that almost nobody mentions, and it changes how much weight that bone can actually carry here. Start with the baseline numbers, which come from published forensic research. In cases of manual strangulation, hands, direct pressure, the hyoid is fractured in roughly a third of victims. In ligature strangulation, that figure drops to around 11%. In hangings, it's lower still, around 8%. Look at those numbers again. Even in the category where hyoid fracture is most common, it's absent in about 2/3 of cases. So an intact hyoid was never strong evidence that strangulation didn't occur. It's a supporting indicator, not a test. Now add the qualifier that matters most here. The hyoid isn't a single solid bone in a young person. It's formed of separate components that fuse together with age, and that fusion typically doesn't begin until roughly a person's 30s, continuing over the years after. Before fusion, the structure is flexible rather than brittle, which means it can absorb force that would fracture an older person's bone. Forensic literature states this directly. Hyoid fractures are rare in the young precisely because the bone hasn't fully ossified. There is even a documented Mississippi case, in a neighboring county, where a forensic anthropologist noted that if manual strangulation had occurred, it was unlikely to have produced a hyoid fracture, specifically because the decedent was young enough that the components of the bone had not yet united. Nolan Wells was 18. So here's the sober reality, and it cuts against the online narrative in both directions at once. If that hyoid bone is examined tomorrow and found perfectly intact, that would not clear anyone of anything. And if it were found fractured in an 18-year-old, that would be extraordinarily significant. An intact hyoid in someone this young is close to uninformative, which means the answer to this particular question may never come from that bone at all. That nuance is missing from almost every version of this story you'll encounter. It's the difference between understanding forensic evidence and simply repeating the word hyoid because it sounds decisive. There's a second inference worth drawing here, and I want to label it clearly as inference rather than fact. Retaining the trachea, larynx, and hyoid is standard practice, but examiners generally do it for a reason. Those structures are typically held back when an examiner wants to study the neck carefully, away from the distortion that dissection itself can cause, specifically to assess whether compression occurred. That does not mean the state examiner suspected strangulation. It does mean the neck was likely being looked at closely. That's a reasonable read of standard practice. It is not a conclusion, and I'd rather flag it as a thread worth watching than sell it to you as a revelation. There were two more limitations, and both trace back to that same sequencing problem. First, decomposition. By the time of the second examination, it was advanced enough that surface bruising could no longer be reliably assessed, its presence or its absence. That's not a small loss. Surface bruising patterns are often where an examiner starts. Second, and by Mitchell's own description the most significant limitation of all, the state's first autopsy had already removed and dissected the organs. That is completely normal procedure. Organs are examined and then returned to the body cavity, which is precisely why they were available to him at all. But it meant he could not directly examine the airway and the lungs for water, and could not assess the stomach contents. There's a broader point here that a forensic pathologist unconnected to this case made publicly, and it's worth hearing because it applies to every second autopsy ever performed. A second examination carries an inherent limitation. The body is never going to be in the pristine, unexamined state the first pathologist encountered. That's not a flaw in the second examiner's work. It's a structural feature of going second. Which brings us to why the lungs and airway mattered so much. And this explains the bottleneck this entire case is stuck inside. In forensic pathology, drowning is what's known as a diagnosis of exclusion. There is no single finding that confirms it. No test that returns a positive result reading drowning. Instead, the examiner rules out everything else. Natural disease, trauma, intoxication, and drowning becomes the remaining supported explanation once the alternatives are gone. And the finding most people assume is definitive. Fluid in the lungs is not unique to drowning at all. That same pulmonary edema appears in heart failure. It appears after resuscitation attempts, and it appears in drug overdose through a very similar physiological pathway. Looking at the lungs alone cannot reliably separate those causes. So the examiner who could have assessed the lungs directly was the first one. The second could not. And the laboratory work that would separate the remaining possibilities has not come back from either side. There's one more technique worth mentioning, because people ask about it constantly, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a confident one. It's called diatom testing. Diatoms are microscopic algae with silica shells found in natural bodies of water. The theory is straightforward. If a person is alive when they enter the water, they inhale it, and their circulation carries these organisms into distant organs. Find diatoms in the bone marrow or liver, and you have support for the conclusion that the person was breathing when they went in. It sounds decisive. In practice, it's contested. Diatoms are everywhere in the environment, which creates contamination risk. A negative result does not exclude drowning, and laboratories vary in how they perform and interpret it, which is why it's used inconsistently rather than as a standard step. There is no indication in the public record that diatom testing was performed in this case, by either side. Whether it could still be, and whether anyone will request it, is a genuinely open question, and one worth asking as this moves forward. If you want the version of this story that explains the science instead of racing past it, That's what this channel does. Subscribe, because when toxicology finally lands, the internet will have a verdict within minutes, and we'd rather bring you the actual finding. So what's the bottom line of the report itself? Cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. And Mitchell closed with 7 specific outstanding questions. They're worth hearing in full because they function as a to-do list for the entire investigation. What were the circumstances that led to Nolan entering the water? What was the position of the body when it was found? Was there water in the airway? Is there evidence of injury to the anterior neck structures? Is there evidence of bleeding inside the skull? What were the stomach contents? And what does toxicology show? Notice what the first one implies. Not whether he drowned, how he came to be in the water at all. Mitchell was explicit that in a suspected drowning, particularly involving someone who could swim, establishing how the person entered the water is central. He does not know whether Nolan was conscious or unconscious. He does not know whether entry was forced or unforced. Those two unknowns are precisely why the finding is undetermined rather than accidental. The report also closed with 2 pieces of standard professional language that most viewers will never have had explained, and both are worth 30 seconds. The first, he reserves the right to review and incorporate additional forensic information as it becomes available. That's not a hedge to be suspicious of. It's a formal statement that this report is preliminary by design and expected to be revised, which is exactly what pending investigation means in practice. The second, his opinions are expressed to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. That phrase has real legal weight. It's the standard an expert must meet for an opinion to be admissible in court. Meaningfully more than a guess, but explicitly not absolute certainty. Understanding that phrase tells you how these documents are meant to be read, as professional judgments with defined limits, not as verdicts. Now, the state's own autopsy. Where is it? Still unfinished. The Jackson County coroner confirmed to reporters this week that the state's report remains incomplete, specifically because it's waiting on toxicology, and noted that its release would come through the prosecutor's office rather than his own. The state medical examiner's office, for its part, said its autopsy was performed in accordance with the standard procedures and protocols followed for all autopsies, and declined to comment on the independent findings. So both tracks, the state's and the family's, are currently stalled at the exact same point, waiting on the same category of laboratory testing through entirely separate systems. That undercuts any suggestion that one side is dragging its feet while the other sprints. Neither side can make a lab move faster. It's worth laying out plainly where the officials in this case actually stand, since their positions have been characterized far more often than they've been quoted. The sheriff has said he suspects Nolan drowned, while maintaining that the investigation remains active and ongoing. He has repeatedly asked the public for original photographs and video from the northwestern part of Horn Island on July 4th. That request has been consistent from early on, and it's the single most useful thing any member of the public can still act on. The district attorney has said the case will be presented to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation is complete, and both her office and the family's attorneys have stressed the same point. Presenting an unnatural or suspicious death to a grand jury is standard operating procedure in that jurisdiction. It does not by itself indicate that a crime is suspected. Her July 15th meeting with the family was the first since Nolan's body was recovered. The state medical examiner has defended its process without engaging the independent findings. None of those positions have changed as a result of this report, at least not publicly, and not yet. Beyond the medical findings, this week brought institutional weight this case hadn't carried before. The announcement was made at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago on the final morning of the gathering. And days before that, the organization's national board had formally adopted a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, explicitly including the United States Department of Justice, to complete a transparent review of how Nolan came to be left on that island, and of everything that happened in the hours before his body was recovered. That's a specific ask, and the specificity matters. It isn't a general call for justice. It names 2 windows, the moment of separation and the hours that followed. The NAACP's president and CEO was pointed, and the precision of his wording deserves attention. He said the organization was not accusing anyone of anything, other than accusing state and local officials of being derelict in their duties to properly investigate. He also said that law enforcement had appeared to repeat what other people were saying rather than investigating for themselves. Notice what that is and isn't. It's a criticism of process, not a claim about outcome. He isn't asserting that Nolan was harmed by another person. He's asserting that the investigation itself should have met a higher standard, regardless of what it eventually concludes. That distinction is going to matter as more public figures weigh in, and it's the kind of thing that gets flattened in a headline. The choice of venue also wasn't incidental. Announcing findings at a national convention rather than a local press conference guaranteed a far larger audience than this update would otherwise have received. That reflects something true of this case since early on. A family and legal team who have consistently chosen visibility and public pressure as their primary tool, rather than working quietly through official channels alone. Whether that strategy ultimately produces answers, it's clearly deliberate. The reward has grown too. It now stands at $125,000, $50,000 from Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network, announced during the eulogy at Nolan's funeral, $50,000 matched by Tyler Perry, who had already paid for the funeral itself, and $25,000 added by Pro Football Hall of Famer Terrell Owens, who attended the service. 2 days before that, the figure had been zero. The reward is offered for information leading to an arrest and a conviction, which is a meaningfully higher bar than information alone, and there is a dedicated tip line for it. Attorney Ben Crump laid out 2 specific demands. First, that Dr. Mitchell be given access to the state's findings and photographs. That request is more substantive than it might sound. Those photographs were taken when Nolan's body was far closer in time to July 4th, before the decomposition that limited so much of the second examination. Photographs cannot replace direct examination, but they can document surface bruising that no longer existed by July 10th. If there is anything to see on the skin, those images are where it survives. Second, that Mitchell be permitted to present his findings before a grand jury, so jurors hear from both examiners rather than only one. That second request is genuinely unusual and worth understanding properly. A grand jury proceeding is not a trial. There is no defense, no cross-examination, no judge weighing arguments. A prosecutor presents the state's evidence, and the jurors decide whether there's enough to charge. Independently retained experts do not typically appear at all. So this is a request, not an entitlement. And whether the district attorney grants it may turn out to be one of the more consequential procedural decisions in this entire case, because it determines whether a grand jury hears a single unified account of the physical evidence, or 2 expert interpretations that don't fully agree. Now let's turn to the water itself, because the physical environment is evidence too, and it's been discussed loosely. The volunteer organization that assisted the search has described the northwestern portion of Horn Island in specific terms. Their president told a national program that the current there rolls and circulates in a way that's earned it a local nickname. They call it the washing machine. He described the depth as changing from 2 or 3 feet to as much as 20 within a couple of steps. That's a specific testable claim about a specific stretch of coastline, and it's different in kind from a witness account of a single afternoon. It's a description of what that place is like generally, from people who work it repeatedly. He also said the body was found in the same vicinity as where a drowning would likely have occurred, that it wasn't unusual for a body to surface right there rather than drifting a great distance. Another representative of the same organization put it more directly still, saying there was no evidence to suggest Nolan had been left somewhere and abandoned, and that the wind and drift patterns tell their own story. That's worth weighing honestly, in both directions. These are the people who physically conducted the search. They aren't neutral scientists, and they aren't investigators, but they're also not speculating from a keyboard. Their read of that water carries a kind of weight that internet analysis simply doesn't. Let's add something to it that nobody in this story has brought up, because it's checkable and it's public. Tide data for the nearest recording station to Horn Island is publicly available for those exact dates. And what it shows is a microtidal environment. The total predicted range across those days stayed under roughly a foot. That's a small tidal swing, which matters because it makes dramatic long-distance tidal transport less likely than many online theories assume, and is broadly consistent with the searcher's description of a body surfacing near where it entered. One more detail from that data. The predicted high tide on the morning of July 6th fell at roughly 9 o'clock, within about 15 minutes of when a National Park Service ranger spotted Nolan's body just before 8:45. Rising water along that shoreline at that hour is at minimum an interesting alignment, and it's the kind of concrete environmental context that speculation can't produce. I want to be careful with that. Predicted tides are not measured currents, and a tide table cannot tell you what happened to a person. But it's real data, publicly checkable, and nobody covering this case had put it on the table. And here's a related correction worth making, because it's already circulating. A tropical storm brushed the Mississippi Gulf Coast in the third week of July. That is more than 2 weeks after Nolan disappeared. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the water conditions on July 4th through 6th. If you see anyone connecting that storm to Nolan's death, or to the recovery of his body, that's a timeline error, and it's the kind that spreads fast because it sounds meteorologically sophisticated. Something else surfaced this week that shows exactly why sourcing discipline matters, including for us. There's now a documented public disagreement about a basic factual detail: what Nolan was wearing when he was found. The volunteer search organization publicly disputed how their statements were being characterized, stating on their own social media that they had not said he was fully clothed, and that he was wearing only swim trunks. One of their representatives said he observed the body from the air, and that what he saw matched photographs taken of Nolan earlier that day. The family's attorney had raised the clothing question as potentially significant, noting Nolan appeared shirtless in video from that afternoon. We're flagging that dispute rather than picking a side, because it's an active disagreement between two parties who were both far closer to this than we are. But it illustrates the pattern that's defined this case from the start. A detail gets repeated, then compressed, then hardened into fact before anyone checks the original. The same discipline applies to the phone, which remains, in evidentiary terms, one of the most important objects in this case. Nolan's phone and his keys were left on his friend's boat. The family's account of what they found on that device once they finally had it, an absence of activity from that day, has been central to public suspicion for weeks. Here's the distinction that matters. Everything known publicly about that phone's contents comes from family members looking at the device and describing what appears to be missing. That is an honest, troubling observation. It is not a forensic extraction. A proper extraction, performed by trained digital examiners, can potentially establish what existed, whether anything was deleted, when, and by what account action. It can distinguish between content that was never saved, content that expired under an app's automatic settings, and content that was actively removed. Those are three very different scenarios that look identical to someone simply scrolling through a phone. Both sides have now agreed to a coordinated examination of that device, with experts from each side present. That is genuinely significant, because evidence examined jointly is far harder to dispute later than evidence handled by one party alone. Whatever that phone holds, or doesn't, is finally on a path to being established rather than argued about. There's one more thread running under all of this, and it deserves acknowledgement. Federal agents have been assisting the county with interstate threats received by people connected to this case. Not with the death investigation itself, the sheriff's office leads that, but with threats sent to individuals over state lines, which is a federal matter. Think about what that means practically. Witnesses in this story are watching that happen. Anyone who was on that island, anyone who saw something from another boat, anyone weighing whether to come forward, is doing that math right now. If participating means becoming a target, that silences the exact people whose information could resolve this. The threats aren't only ugly, they're actively working against the answers this family is asking for. Which brings us to something you deserve to be warned about directly. There are articles circulating right now, polished, confident, showing up in ordinary search results, that claim this autopsy revealed defensive wounds on the forearms, confirmed blunt force trauma the first examination missed, and that toxicology results are already complete. They quote a forensic expert by name, with credentials, offering dramatic conclusions. None of it is real. That expert does not exist. There are no defensive wounds in this report. Toxicology is not back from either side. These pages appear to be automatically generated, built to harvest search traffic using a dead teenager's name, and some of them push readers toward downloads and affiliate links. The tell is usually the confidence. Real forensic documents are full of hedges, limitations, and phrases like unclear and cannot rule out. Fabricated ones deliver clean, dramatic certainty, because certainty is what gets clicked. So here's a practical filter that will serve you well beyond this case. If a claim about Nolan Wells doesn't trace back to a named, verifiable source, a real pathologist, a named official, an established news organization, treat it as fiction until it does. In this case, the fabrications have been more dramatic than the facts every single time. So let's be precise about where all of this leaves us. What's confirmed? An area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue at the back of the head. Cause unclear. No laceration of the skin above it, no fracture of the skull beneath it, no other fractures or deep tissue injuries anywhere on the body. Anterior neck structures retained by the state and unavailable to the independent examiner. Organs already dissected, so the lungs, airway, and stomach could not be directly assessed. Decomposition advanced enough to obscure surface bruising. No toxicology from either side. Cause and manner, undetermined, pending investigation. What remains genuinely unknown? What caused that discoloration? What the neck structures would show if examined? Whether Nolan was conscious when he entered the water. Whether that entry was forced or unforced. Whether there was bleeding inside the skull. And what toxicology will eventually reveal. I want to state one distinction as plainly as I can, because it's the most important thing to take from tonight. A pathologist saying he cannot rule out foul play is not the same as a pathologist saying he found evidence of foul play. Both statements are true right now. They are not interchangeable, and the gap between them is where this entire story is currently being distorted. This case has already been damaged repeatedly by collapsing one into the other. With the video, with the misstated photograph, with witness statements treated as established fact before anyone checked them. This finding deserves better than that same treatment, no matter how dramatic a number sounds once it's stripped of context. There's a version of this story that would get more views tonight. It's the one where 12 by 8 inches is a wound, the missing neck structures are a cover-up, and the case is solved by the end of the video. That version is easier to make and easier to watch. It's also not what the document says. So here's the honest shape of what changed this week. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, this case has an actual documented physical finding rather than only competing accounts and viral speculation. It also has a formally documented gap, one that exists not through anyone's misconduct, but through the ordinary sequencing of 2 separate examinations. And that gap touches the exact question of whether Nolan may have been harmed by another person. Both of those things are now permanently on the record. Neither of them is an answer. There's a pattern worth naming as we close, because it's run through every development in this case. Each new piece of information, the GPS data, the dispatch call, the witness accounts, and now this report, has done the same 2 things simultaneously. It's added real, concrete substance where there had been speculation. And it's opened new, more specific questions that didn't exist before. That isn't a flaw in how this case is unfolding. It's what a careful investigation actually looks like from the outside. Incremental, frequently frustrating, and rarely delivering the single dramatic answer that true crime coverage so often promises. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He was days away from a college football season he'd worked years to reach. Nearly 3 weeks after he disappeared, his family finally has one concrete medical detail about what was found, and a clear, documented list of the questions that still stand between them and the truth. It doesn't answer what they've been asking since that first night, but for a family living inside a grief that can't settle because the story has no ending, one documented fact and 7 specific questions is more than they had the day before. We'll stay on this. Toxicology from both sides. The state's completed report, whether Dr. Mitchell is granted access to those photographs, the joint examination of the phone, and whatever a grand jury eventually does with all of it. The moment there's something verified to tell you, you'll hear it here, and not a moment before. Before you go, of the 7 questions Dr. Mitchell listed, which one do you believe finally breaks this case open? How he entered the water, what the neck structures would show, or what toxicology reveals? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and more than once, what a viewer noticed has shaped what we covered next. And if you'd rather have the verified version of this story than the viral one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Anyone can post a headline. We'd rather wait for the report. If you have original, unedited photographs or video from Horn Island on the 4th of July, the originals, not screenshots, not reposts, contact the Jackson County Sheriff's Office directly. What's sitting in someone's camera roll may still matter more than everything said about this case online combined. Thank you for watching. Stay careful with what you share, stay kind to the people inside these stories, and we'll see you on the next update.